All right. I think technology has hopefully served for us. So welcome, a warm welcome to Nicole and Panthea and Audrey and Ceasar. And, thanks to everyone for joining across a bunch of different time zones. It's always fun to gather different times of the day. I've been looking forward to this conversation for a long time, so I'm really excited that it's finally here, and I'm excited that we have Nicole to help host this conversation. And I'll say a bit more about that in a second before I hand it to Nicole, but just a little bit of context for folks in the room with each other and for those who are joining us live. My name is Brian Stout. I'm currently based here in Southern Oregon, and I'm a middle child, father of two, mediator, a connector, and the initiator of a global collaborative called Building Belonging. And we are an online home for people who are trying to build a world where everyone belongs. And today's gathering is part of a series that I've been curating over the last year or so called Conversations on Transformation. And it's around how transformation happens, individual transformation, interpersonal, societal, structures and systems. And we're looking at it all through the lens of belonging. So today we will talk about belonging, as always, and specifically how to cultivate belonging at every scale. So I think about this interpersonal relationships with your partner, with your family, with your community, nation state, and beyond. And we are super lucky today to have folks who've been thinking and practicing on that question in lots of different and very interesting ways for a long time. So hoping to get into that a bit here. And just to be clear that for me and for us, I think this is not the soft belonging of social media, not the superficial belonging of a ballot box every 4 years, but sort of the deep practice of belonging together, which is, to me, the real potential democracy. So I'm excited to be in practice today with this group of folks and with Nicole Chi, who will be hosting us today. Nicole actually has been my mentor in the civic technology space, and so I'm grateful to her for introducing me to Audrey's work a few years ago around Taiwan and helping tie together some of the threads that we'll be getting into today. Before I hand it to Nicole, and then I'll be dropping off screen to interact with some of the folks who are joining us live and hopefully bringing some of those questions into the room here. I just want to acknowledge that we are gathering at a crazy time when belonging and democracy are both violently contested. And I'm thinking in particular, I lived in Myanmar back in 2012 and 2013 and feeling a lot of solidarity with people there who are suffering a military coup. Here in the US, attacks on Asians and Asian Americans continue to be a scourge. And our elected officials are passing voter restrictions in Georgia to take away democracy from primarily communities of color. So before we dive in, I'm feeling a desire to just take a deep breath, invite you to do it with me if you feel like it, folks here in the room and folks joining us online. Just to center ourselves in this conversation that we want to have together for the next 80 minutes or so. So I'm going to do that as well, invite you to take a couple breaths. And just notice where you might be carrying tension, where your thoughts might be flying off to, whatever else is competing for your energy right now. And invite you to just reflect on why you're choosing to spend some time with this group of folks today and what you're hoping to take away from our time together. So with that, we're going to practice belonging together for the next 80 minutes or so, and I will hand it to Nicole. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Brian. And I feel like every conversation around technology and social impact needs to start with a few caveats. So I want to start with that. I think the tech sector has been through a moral reckoning for the past 5 years, especially since 2016 in Cambridge Analytica. Technology has provided a lot of dangerous warning signs for why scale can actually be dangerous. While it has allowed amazing mass movements to organize on social media, it has also allowed for large-scale information warfare. While it's allowed us to really leverage data for more informed decision-making, it's also, algorithms have magnified all sorts of existing biases in society. And so while we don't want to veer towards techno-solutionism, and we know that tech won't save us, we also know that because of the world we live in today, it's a necessary part of building a world in which everyone belongs. So the digital world is now a place where politics are discussed, where hearts and minds are changed. It's becoming a really important piece of the puzzle when it comes to participatory democracy and community formation, and how we even define our community as not just being a place where we live physically, but also a place where we live virtually. So I think we who care about democracy and belonging, so everyone who's listening into this conversation as well as everyone who's a part of it, need to consider what it looks like, what it would look like to actually design and use technology that supports our vision for a world in which everyone belongs, not letting the private sector tech companies kind of inform that vision for us. And I think that's one of my main hopes and goals for this conversation. Our speakers today are not just technologists. Actually, I don't even think all of you would define yourselves as technologists, but I think each of you all are experts in your own right when it comes to the intersection of digital work and democracy. And I'm hoping to find a conversation today among the three of you that helps people come away with a more nuanced understanding of scale and the role that technology plays in scaling belonging. Not just getting bigger, but also practicing deep democracy at each scale, connecting small to large, influencing our interactions with one another interpersonally, from small groups to nation states to internationally, without privileging one over another. And so with those opening statements, I'd love to start with introductions. The way that we typically structure these introductions is with the format I am, my people are, and I belong to as a prompt. So I'll give an example and also introduce myself. I'm Nicole. I'm a civic technologist, facilitator, and perpetually curious person who's hopped around a lot of different sectors, from the tech sector to nonprofits to policy research, and then back to environmental tech in search for what technology can do for people. My people are the skeptics and cautious optimists of technology. So on the one hand, we critique technology loudly. On the other hand, we do have for what technology can do and hopes that it can actually support rather than disproportionately harming Black, brown, poor, disabled, sex workers, and other underserved communities. I think my people are also bridgers and connectors, so folks in the building belonging space. And I also self-identify as a Taiwanese American and part of the queer community, which has taught me so much about what it means to be, means to choose your family, and the power of chosen family and the power of shaping your conceptions of belonging through that queer lens and intersectional lens. And I'll let Ceasar introduce himself next.
Thank you, Nicole. It's great to be here. It's interesting, this prompt. I am, my people are, I belong to. As I think about it, I want to start with first kind of like, I'm the son of Robert and Pluma McDowell. I am the husband of soul boss Shalik McDowell, the father of Brandon and Gabrielle McDowell, grandfather of Ashley and Cassius McDowell. But I'm also, I'm a professor at MIT. I am a strong believer in civic processes, and I do work around the intentional design of new civic spaces. When I think about my people, where I come from, it's a hard one. I say, my people, and I'm from so many places, my people are too, and it's hard to recount, except for I can say really truly that I am a person of the Deep South, and also of the West of the United States. Those two places have real homes for me, and where I feel a sense of groundedness. I belong to, so this is interesting, because I've never introduced myself this way. And so when I got to I belong to, I paused, right? I was thinking about this earlier today, and I was wondering why I paused, and I think it was because of the phrasing, belong to. Because it's like, the I see myself, I don't want to say belong to, it's familiar. I can think of myself, I belong to a community. right? I understand that meaning of it, but it also has an oppressive colonial sense to it, particularly for people who come from the descendants of those who were enslaved, to belong to someone. And so it's a mixed meaning for me to say that word. So I started thinking about maybe it's belong to o versus belong to. I mean, belong too versus belong to. And so I'm struggling with this one right now. It's a very interesting one. So I'm just going to end by just saying I belong.
Audrey, would you like to introduce yourself next?
Sure. I'm Audrey Tang. I'm a poetician, currently serving as digital minister in Taiwan with a lowercase m minister. And my work usually centers around like overcoming the pandemic with no lockdown, overcoming the infodemic with no takedown through digital democracy means. So I guess my people are, well, the demos, right? The people, anyone living, and more importantly, arguably, anyone who is not yet living but will live in a generation or two. And these are my people, the Homo sapiens community, but also what I refer to Internet of beings, like mountains, rivers that could be sensed as beings through the Internet, are my people too. I belong to the here and now. I belong to this conversation that I can be sure of.
I love that. And Panthea?
This is such a lovely way to get to know everyone. So I am Panthea, born Peisan, daughter of Ming and Beizhen. I was born in Taipei 4 years before the end of the longest period of martial law in the world at that time. A fact that has left an indelible mark on my family, and I assume some of yours as well, a fact that I'm still sort of grappling with today. My family immigrated to Canada when I was 6, and I grew up on the West Coast in Vancouver. And I'm currently based on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people, currently known as Brooklyn, New York. Nowadays, I work at the intersection of a lot of groups that I often say don't always understand each other or like each other. So community groups, activists, governments, international agencies. And my practice is really geared towards cultural organizing and social justice mediation. Right now, really focused on the intersection of trauma and healing and active democracy and decolonized futures. My people are all over the world, a result of an itinerant life. And I think those I gravitate towards are those that are curious and, give ourselves the grace to be forever learning and failing and evolving, and who are just clear-eyed about the cruelty and violence of the world, and yet continue to try and cultivate beauty and joy and belonging, I guess, wherever we can. And I belong to my ancestors who have sacrificed so much for me to be here, and to all of those fighting with courage and humility for collective liberation. So it's lovely to be with you all.
Sure.
Thank you all for those wonderful introductions. I'm so grateful to be able to host this conversation. And now I would love to give all of you the opportunity to share some of your opening thoughts about this topic of scaling deep democracy through technology. I'll give each of you a guiding question, but feel free to take it or say whatever other opening statements you'd like to. I think part of the purpose for these opening statements is also for you all to get to know each other a little bit better as well, understanding a little bit more about where each of your perspectives come into this topic, so we can have a richer conversation, and even starting to pose questions to each other of some of the themes that we'd like to discuss today. So I'd love to start with you again, Ceasar, to help orient us to our aspirations, a world in which everyone belongs, that's made real through the practice of deep democracy. My question for you is, how would you define deep democracy? What does it look like? And what are you hoping to discuss in today's conversation?
Well, I want to sidestep that question just a little bit. I'll get back to it, I promise.
Totally.
But I'm thinking about the relationship between deep democracy and technology, just how those things are related. And as I always want to, I need to tell a story about a friend of mine. So I have this friend named Dick Katz. And Dick is an anthropologist, and in the 60s, he spent a lot of his life living among the Coon in the Kalahari Desert. And he was really interested in the question about spirituality and the ways in which the Coon actually organized their communities, and how a sense of spirit and healing was an important part of even how they physically structured their villages. And so he spent a number of years there, and as an anthropologist, he was recording lots of conversations and learning the language and so on and so forth. And he became really close with one particular healer in the community named Thomaso. And Dick recounts this story where one day after, he had probably been there on and off for 4 years, Thomaso asked him about the tape recorder, right? And so this is an old-time reel-to-reel portable tape recorder, a Nagra, and how it works. And so Thomaso asked him, so how does that thing work? And Dick started to explain it to him that, well, you speak into this thing, this microphone, and it changes the vibration of your voice to some electromagnetic thing that goes down this wire, and it goes over to this head, and it's transferred to this tape. And Thomason says, no, wait, how does it work? And Dick tried to explain it again. And then Thomason said, well, where did you get it? And Dick says, well, I bought it in the store. And he says, oh, okay. So did the people in the store tell you how it worked and you just forgot? And he says, no, they just sold it to me. And I bought it. And after they had gone round and round about this, Thomas finally said to him, in our culture, we would never give someone so powerful a tool without them understanding how it works. And what he meant by understanding was not the mechanics of it, but he meant, what's your way of seeing the world and our place in the world that would allow you to create such a thing? And so when I think about how we go about imagining issues of technology, and we think about deep democracy, I think this is the central question we're really struggling with, is who are we as human beings and how are we connected to each other? And right now, it's really, it's kind of hard to stay centered on that because we have two things going on. We have a technology realm around us that's basically keeping us very fragmented. And at the same time, we're living in these places where increasingly we're living with what I like to say is the most demographically complex set of people who've ever lived together. And yet we have no infrastructure or process in place that can support that kind of public to do what a public needs to do in a democracy. So one of our struggles right now, I think both on the human side and the technological side of really getting to deep democracy is, how are we going to actually build that kind of infrastructure and those processes that are going to allow us to have the kind of relational connections to each other that are essential for deep democracy to happen, right? So I think that's the struggle for me in all of this, And when I say struggle, I don't mean struggle in that like I'm carrying a weight up a hill. I mean it more like this is the problem to confront. And then confronting it, there's joy in that, there's success in that, but it's an ongoing piece of work, right? I really have a belief that the work of democracy is ongoing. It's not a thing we solve. It's a thing we strive for, right? Because we will continually be, I think, at the edges, what I like to call those folks who are really marginalized by whatever system we put in. So we'll continually have to figure out what are we doing to bring them in or to bring us in relationship with them, whoever that may be. So if I go back to your initial question, what does deep democracy mean to me? And this notion of deep democracy is really kind of grounded on systems and processes that connect people so that they can actually exist in authentic relationships with each other.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot to respond to there, so I'm sure some of our other speakers will want to follow up to that. Audrey, so you have implemented technology at scale in Taiwan in service of democracy. I know you also care a lot about bridging the digital divide because we know that technology can also create barriers to entry. And so I'm curious, what are some of your opening thoughts based on your experience that you'd like to frame in this conversation? How do you think that civic technology has shaped othering or belonging at scale in Taiwan? And again, feel free to respond to another question as well.
That's fine. Yeah, when we talk about civic technology, there's a kind of very popular term going around saying that like tape recorder or nowadays social media or recording devices of all sorts are being democratized in the English-speaking narrative. I always find some difficulties with that term, much as how Ceasar has some difficulties with the term belonging, because to me, to someone who was born in the martial law and remembers quite vividly how the martial law feels like, and then Taiwan gradually started democratization, culminating in the first presidential election in 1996. To me, democratized means that people understand how things work. People understand how to govern, that is to say, how to settle the inevitable disputes and things like that together with grace. And this is the social sector, the Taiwan's community building activists, the co-ops movements, the charities, and so on, that were the bedrocks of Taiwan's democratization even before we had a constitutional change that enabled the lifting of the martial law. So, so democratization to me means something that's by definition very deep. It definitely doesn't mean that everybody can buy it at a store. That's just, I guess it can call it more accessible, but probably not more democratized. So to me, democracy itself, I think of it as a form of technology. In particular, I often explain to Japanese journalists who, for a while, keep referring me to themselves as the IT minister, and I keep telling them that IT connects only machines, but digital connects people. And democracy is one of the forms of social technologies that connects people so that what used to be showdown between opposing values can, with careful design, become a conversation between diverse values. And that's democracy as a form of technology to me. So I talk about, say, the bit rate of democracy, right? How much people can just pick up a phone and call the toll-free number 1922. There are more than 2 million calls last year to get everything they want from the Central Epidemic Command Center, to get all the measures explained, actually by the very charity group, the Tzu Chi group is taking over the call center now, and all the issues that they report, like a young boy calling saying, "You're rationing out mask. All I get is pink medical mask that was last April. I don't want to wear it to school. The boys in my class all have navy blue ones. They will laugh at me." And then the very next day on the daily 2 p.m. press conference live stream to the country, all the medical officers, regardless of gender, wore pink mask. And then suddenly pink just became the most hip color. And that's democracy to me. That's a very high bandwidth, very short response cycle, but with a very deep listening. Consider if the CCC took maybe 2 months, which is actually quite short in freedom of information timescale. If it takes them 60 days to respond, then the boy would not feel that they're empowered to contribute to democracy. On the other hand, if they respond within a day, but said something that about bullying is bad, about punishing people who bully, and so on, and that causes divisiveness. But by essentially gender mainstreaming, the color pink, everyone got into the conversation, and then the adoption of mask wearing to protect oneself against one's own unwashed hand, regardless of color, suddenly increased, and then we moved to the post-pandemic phase in Taiwan last May. So I think that's one of the more recent memories of how a real-time, deeply listened to, scalable, like 2 million calls a year, democracy works.
Yeah, I think that framing is so interesting. Democracy as a form of social technology. I feel like I have to think more about that one. And Panthea, I think you've done somewhat similar work as Audrey, but on an international scale as well. I know I was just reading about some of your work building Libya's first ever mobile-based voter registration system. You've done a number of other projects along a similar vein. Can you speak a little bit to your experience, what you're coming to this conversation with in terms of how you've seen technology and belonging work together or at odds with each other?
Yeah, sure. I would never describe what I've done as sort of similar to Audrey. I think Audrey's in her own league. But I will say, yeah, when I was thinking about this conversation today, and from our sort of chat before, Nicole, that I was entering a little bit skeptical. I was skeptical that technology and scale should be the starting points. But I came around, and I think it was because I, had spent most of my 20s and 30s trying to build technology for social change, and seduced by the allure of scale, which then kind of tech seems like a neat solution. And now I think we look at the largest tech platforms, multinational companies, multilateral agencies, and we cringe. And so but I'm also convinced that just trying to, I do believe small is beautiful, and yet at the same time, that can't be the only answer, because our, quote unquote, opposition, so to speak, is well-funded, well-resourced, and thinking, and putting out, creating very oppressive and harmful and biased tech. So when I was thinking about this conversation and how, in my own experience of belonging and technology, I actually thought to being a teenager, and I don't think I've ever told anyone this before, but this is just kind of what came into my head as I was thinking about this conversation. When I was about 12 or 13, I was a really dorky kid. We'd immigrated to Canada, and I didn't really fit in. And so I was really into historical fiction, science fiction. I was just trying to escape. And then we started we got the internet, and I started getting into AOL chat rooms. I think Tequila Sunrise or something was the one that I kept going to. And I was 12 or 13, and at the time I started pretending to be a white woman. I pretended to be a white girl. I think I cut out a photo from a magazine or something. Whenever someone asked for it, I wasn't doing anything weird or inappropriate, I promise. It's very PG, very innocent. But I had internalized that self-loathing, and I wasn't fitting in. And so the only way that I thought I could fit in or belong to where I was to kind of go online, hide behind an avatar, and make friends that way. I was just so desperate for some comfort. And then fast forward sort of 4 years later, I sort of left that, though apologies to Ryan from Huntington Beach, California, if you're ever seeing this, she wasn't real. But I found a different community. And I found in Vancouver at the time, I found a community around the rave scene at the time, and these internet message boards talking about sort of music and queer identity and art and free expression. And that I started gravitating towards. And, I was on these internet message boards, and then over time I found people, went to my first rave, and I just found comfort and like solace in these people that were coming together to rebel against like common societal norms, and sort of this community that was challenging the received wisdom, but really sort of received barriers that had been handed down. And I think that then sort of IRC chat rooms, kind of just all the rest of it. And I think back to it now because, what the technology did then was just, it enabled this community that was coming together around shared value, shared identity, that was trying to explore this together, that was rejecting sort of mainstream norms, rejecting like the AOL, tequila sunrises, whatever, built our own community called Lounge X, very like 90s, Neuromancer. But it was a community that sort of embraced these values and then tried to think about how technology could enable these around these human, authentic connections, like Ceasar was saying. And so now when I think about my work, I'm often trying to build communities and build coalitions and build folks coming together that often don't like each other. And usually what I'm trying to do when people first meet, whether it's digital or face-to-face, it's often been face-to-face, but I'm trying to break people out of the mindset of coming in with all the baggage in the world that we've inherited. So this is my position. This is my title. This is my sense of urgency over the outputs that we need to be building rather than the relationships we need to be cultivating and nurturing and whatnot. And so often I think that's what I'm fighting against. And, there's different like techniques or whatever that we can talk about. But I think as a facilitator, mediator, I see that as my most important role, because if you can do that, then people can start designing or creating or whatnot anew and breaking out of these harmful norms that we've been handed down. I mean, just talking about democracy, like representative electoral democracy has only been sort of the norm for like 300 years. It's so young. We can think about other visions and other versions of this. And yet in this country, I'm based in the US now, the amount of attention we spend focused on elections is insane. It's absolutely bonkers, the amount of money, the attention, the whatnot. And I think over the course, certainly of the pandemic, we love talking about big D democracy and elections, and we think of it as like, like rule of law, like, like integrity of rights, like all these things, political scientists like to talk about. But I see democracy, and then we talk about democratic backsliding, like, the US is in decline, but I don't see it as just like a slider like this. I see it as like a 2x2, so not just a big D democracy at the top, but like democracy, quote unquote, at the bottom. It's a terrible way of looking at it. But like we see when the pandemic hits, all bets are off, things aren't operating as normal, like people are coming together in beautiful ways, and challenging these notions that, men left to their own devices, we're going to descend on a war of man upon man. It's ridiculous. We are like loving and altruistic and beautiful and kind, but the narratives that we've been sold are to tell us that we don't have that agency. We have to hire someone that represents our values and put them somewhere else. And I think there's lots of ways that we can challenge that, both face to face and think about building online spaces and digital connections to cultivate that. So anyway, just some opening thoughts.
Thank you for sharing, Panthea. And again, I feel like there's so many things that one can respond to here. So before I go into some of my pre-prepared questions, I would just love to give you all a chance to respond to each other's opening statements if you so wish. If there are any pieces that you want each other to elaborate on or questions, we can start the conversation from there. If not, then I can continue to shape the conversation.
No, I was listening to. Oh, please go on.
Wow.
Please.
Yeah, the thing about GC is the nonverbal cues doesn't translate so quickly, so people get. So my comment is a really short one. It's a Buckminster Fuller idea that instead of top down or bottom up, grassroots or whatever, up and down speak, which on the planetary scale you know, you're up in New York is probably down in Taiwan, so it doesn't work that way. So Fuller thought maybe more appropriately it's out as in outward toward space and inward toward the core of the Earth instead of top and down respectively. And I think it's a really charming and useful way of thinking that instead of saying we're building bottom up, we can say we're building from the deep side, right? From the inside, and then scaling it out. And I think that's like a plant growing. It's quite powerful in that way because grassroots can surround the earth quite easily when it spreads, but it doesn't carry the same kind of gravity notion of the up being by definition better or things like that. It's just very organic, like growing outward and skyward, if you will, but it doesn't say bottom is bad or inferior, just a random thought.
Yeah, I love that because the way that we've organized these building belonging conversations is also thinking about the I-we world, which I think is very similar.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. You know, I was, Audrey, when you were speaking, and also when you were speaking, I was thinking about going back to the original question, what I mean by deep democracy. And I borrowed this quote from a friend of mine who wrote it about something else, but for me, it's probably the best definition of democracy I've ever heard. And basically goes like this. It's like democracy exists when people who are interdependent can struggle with the traditions that bind them and the interests that separate them so they can realize a future that's an equitable improvement on the past. And I just think it's really elegant because I think that's really where we are, is in these notions that there's this constant struggle about things that are binding us. And the interesting thing about using those words is things can bind you to hold you safely and things can bind you to keep you from growing, right? Both, you can do both things. And that we have these interests that are separating us. The other thing I really love about it is that the measure of progress is that we're making these equitable improvements on the past. So you have to look back to know that you're going forward, right? You have to do that to just kind of know that you're moving forward. And so when I think about that, and this goes right back to where we were, but it says our challenge is how do we design and create those spaces so that struggle can happen peacefully, right? That's where we are, you know, it's just trying to figure that out and design those different kinds of spaces. And technology, I think, has a major component of that.
I think one of the challenges, just to both what you're saying now, is whether it is adding that dimension of time or sort of how we're sort of moving within sort of spaces and design conversations. I think so much of what I see is we don't bring it. We're almost taking like ahistorical approaches to design. We're taking sort of these like top down, Audrey, to your point, and I think that and that doesn't then recognizes all the past harms that have come before that also bind us, right? So if we are to free ourselves of them, how do we recognize and have a reckoning and have that conversation first? Because I think about, like ultimately democracy, people power, like how do we recognize, yes, that we all have like this deep embodied understanding of our own inherent value and worth, and that does not need to come at the expense of someone else's value and worth and sense of belonging and safety. But we have been taught, we had a narrow sort of few greedy, mostly men, telling us like, whether it's all the isms, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, like we've had to sort of create these categories of people for some to have and others to have not. And so how do we break that? And I don't think we have a lot of conversations when we're talking about design, when we're talking about change, about the histories and the lineages that have come before that bind us. And so when Caesar, your initial definition, which I wrote down, like how do we sort of connect people in authentic relationships? I don't think we can have those authentic relationships until we have that reckoning. And I think what I see right now in a lot of digital spaces, I think the writer Gia Tolentino gives like a really good analogy, which she says like right now online, so much of it is, she's like, okay, imagine you go on a really fun trip to Mexico. It's really wild. And then you come back and the story that you tell will be different to your grandmother than it would be to your best friend, than it would be to your partner, than it would be, to whatnot. And you come in and the internet right now is that you come in and you're just like basically like walking into a party and you're just telling everybody at the same time the exact same story. You don't get to, have the nuance and the differences and the different tellings of it and different relationships that we have with different people. My people have harmed your people in the past. How do we talk about that? Our people need to do this kind of work around how we let go of power. How do we do that? We're kind of flattening our experiences and then talking about it at the same time in this broadcast format. That's not really allowing us to sort of explore the nuances, I think, that would help us be in deeper, more authentic relationship. And so anyway, that's just what came to mind for me.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think it reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with Dana Boyd's work on affordances of technology, but it reminds me of a lot of the things that she highlights in that paper. So I think one of the things that all three of you mentioned in these framing statements was this idea of conflict at the interpersonal level, and how do we handle that with grace, even just at the most smallest individual and interpersonal level, because it is the building block of the type of democracy that we want. And I'm curious for you all, what do you think, if at all, the role of technology is in mediating or facilitating this type of conflict, that interpersonal conflict? I know from all of your work that just as you work in digital spaces, there's also a level of analog that I think all of you do and really value as well. So I'm curious if, with regards to conflicts interpersonally, if all of that is happening at the analog level of humans mediating humans, or if there are pieces of it that you feel like you can address at the tech level as well.
I'm not going first anymore.
Okay, well, you're the first to say that. Yeah, I think one of the practices that I do personally is troll hugging, and I even blogged about it. It's my hobby. And I guess this is applying something from the analog space that I learned into the digital space so that it works in either format. Now, troll hugging basically is applied nonviolent communication. And to me, NVC or open space technology, OST, are technologies. I mean, OST said technology on its tin, right? So they are social technologies, and so should be treated as such, like applied with a intention and understanding the effects and side effects of technologies. All these usual caveats about technologies also apply to social technologies. And so in troll hugging, usually I respond to people attacking me personally. It started in IRC chat rooms, and then later on all sort of antisocial corners of social media. And then because I've been working with the Siri team for 6 years before joining the cabinet, I see them as corpus, like really as ways to understand better what the speaker's intentions are. And I promptly replied, but only to, if they said 100 words, only to the 5 words that could be construed as constructive. That's what Siri does, by the way. And then we just engage in a real authentic conversation. And so this is both in the broadcast format as signaling to the community that only authentic or constructive narratives or utterances gets any attention at all. And because the trolls, they crave attention anyway, but was stuck in the transactional, not the relational quality of the low quality attention they were able to get by trolling. And so paradoxically, by encouraging them to reveal more of themselves, they become less trollish. And then I've got many friends and ones who even visited me on the Social Innovation Lab, which is a public park that I work, because of these conversations, and by very simply just responding to the part that are constructive and treating everything else as corpus. And I think this is quite interesting on a personal level as well, because I'm now almost reflectively, when seeing anything that tries to upset me and so on, I don't feel upset anymore. I feel a deep calmness. And then I see those personal attack words. If there are new words that tries to upset me, I don't know, drink some interesting tea or coffee or mixed drink that's new to my sensory functions. And when I get enough sleep that day, I usually do 8 hours of sleep, it forms a long-term association that associate these words into a pleasant feeling. So the next time I look at it, I smile about it, and then I only respond to the ones that are constructive. So that's a little bit of, I guess, not just MVC, but also mindfulness and so on in analog space, and then a commitment to just respond in a pro-social way, and that could serve as a kind of invitation for people to be more authentic about themselves. So this is purely individual level for me.
That's some next level human stuff.
Yeah.
Feeling the rush of feeling
That's
the troll hugging. That's yeah. That's I've certainly read about that practice or your practice, but yeah, that's very admirable. Because I think most of us are not like that, right? Most of us, when we get attacked, we're like, well, let me tell you. And I think also, you know, I think a lot of right now our platforms and the way that they're designed, which then the type of like discourse they are enabling and fueling are, you know, like are just enabling more and more. So, you know, calling out cancel culture, whatnot, which came from, you know, like its roots, you know, had value, you know, for historically marginalized communities to call out abusers of power, like, you know, but I also think sometimes the way that our mainstream tech platforms are designed, it's kind of like at fever pitch, it's kind of sort of like run away in some senses. And then you also take a look at how, you know, now like mainstream media covers social media fights as like news, and it's all just, I feel like we're like descending into idiocracy. And you know, so I think there are other ways to design. I think right now it's the question around, you know, who is taking the design decisions and for what, you know, like outcomes and metrics, like how are we measuring success, you know, like, because we know that the like antagonistic comments are going to get the clicks, like we have this kind of like sports team mentality, right? Like go, you want to see that like fight. And what's that doing to us as people, you know, because most of us are not like Audrey, we don't have that discipline. And so I think, and so right now, I mean, with the current state of things, I don't know, because, and Ceasar's going to end, and by giving us all the answer, I think that like there are conflicts that are really hard in my role as, you know, doing sort of mediation facilitation, like I think that are hard right now for me to see how to solve online, which is these like really deep interpersonal things. Like I just don't know how. I'm not skilled enough, you know, like I just don't know how to do that without bringing people like together. Now that could be like mediated through like a video conference or whatever, but like for people to see each other and to have that dialogue for me feels really, really important. But I think there are other types of conflicts where technology has a huge role to play. And I think oftentimes that's our conflicts around ideas, around policy, around, I think so oftentimes we take a look at why we're all so suspicious of lobbying, right? It's people in relationship with one another that are then going to take decisions that, impact the rest of us. And just recently, I think I'm trying to it's the Environmental Justice for All Act that just been reintroduced in the House here. And that was developed collaboratively using, you all might be familiar with the platform Popbox, or sort of they went to Popbox sort of helped facilitate this process and bringing in lots of, input from communities that have been disproportionately impacted by environmental harm, so communities of color, low-income communities, indigenous communities, people come together and, we're commenting on this legislation and refined it in this long, open, collaborative process. And the result is quite a groundbreaking bill. And you see sort of folks on the committee, I think you see sort of congressional staffers being like, oh, interesting, communities actually came up with useful inputs, as if they're surprised. But, of course, but this became like an equalizer. You did not need to have a federal lobbyist in DC to be part of the process. So how do we sort of use, for these types of conflicts? Because otherwise, I think also sometimes as someone who's getting inputs from a lot of different constituent groups, sometimes when you're trying to come up with the answer between all these different conflicting voices, what ends up happening is you're trying to do your very best to satisfy everybody. But what happens is you get a lowest common denominator, like a diluted solution as a result of that, and then no one's happy. But if you make the process transparent and allow people to see and have dialogue, around all of these sort of conflicting ideas, not everyone's going to agree on the final outcome, but they can see where it came from. And I think those types of conflicts are where, tech platforms and the transparency and the collaboration at scale that they enable can be hugely beneficial.
We over at MIT, Deb Roy just started this new center called the Center for Constructive Communication. Really kind of was born out of a couple of things. One is how do we build new social technologies that really are kind of grounded in the idea of democracy, deep democracy, and also deal with the issues of misinformation and disinformation in the information sphere, and particularly in the social media technologies that are out there. And one of the issues, one of the things they're dealing with is this question of scale, that how do you build something like this where the scale is local, that the ability to connect across local is possible also. And I'm not talking about like a next door kind of thing, but they're working on some really interesting conversational tools, facilitated dialogues, and how to take things both that are happening analog and in digital, using a little bit of AI and NLP work with human interactions and decision making and oversight in that to I don't want to say animate, but take conversations that a set of people are having, and then be able to put those into a data set and online where people can go back and look at their own conversation, lift up the themes are lifted up out of that. But the thing that's important about it, you can do that with a lot of things, right? You can record a conversation, you can put it up on the web, you can look at it over time and see who's saying what over time. But what it's doing, what they're trying to do is give people authority and ownership over their piece of the conversation. And to allow, if people want to, their conversation to travel, segments of the conversation to travel from one place to another. And here's why that's important, because one of the things we're doing right now, even when we think about kind of robust engagement process with the public, we're pretty much keeping people still in these silos, right? Now is your time to talk about housing, okay? Tell us everything, get us involved, build the thing around housing. Next week, you can come and talk about healthcare, right? And then 2 years from now, you might be able to talk about this, but nobody lives their life that way, right? They live their lives with all those things at the same time, right? And we don't have actually mechanisms that allow you to then interconnect those things, right? So if I'm sitting in a conversation and I'm in that conversation and I reveal something about my own experience related to policing, and the conversation comes up around, we're dealing with some policing issue in the community, why can't I have a way of owning that piece of the conversation I had and put it in
Right.
to the public conversation that's happening now, right? So that's an affordance the technology could allow you if you decided to do that, right? As opposed to saying, no, you as a person have to show up in every place, every space to have your voice heard, as opposed to say, well, actually, I have a representation of what I believe that I should be able to put into the queue with everything else to be part of the conversation. And yes, I said it in another meeting that was actually about lawn care, but it doesn't matter. It's on topic for the thing that you're dealing with. So I just kind of named that problem because I think one of the you said this before, Panthea, about kind of how old our kind of practice of democracy is like in this country. And you said it's only 300 years old, but I actually think that's not the problem. The problem is not that it's 300 years old, but when it was actually designed 300 years ago, it was designed as a structure of exclusion, right? And what we've been doing over time is trying to tweak it to make it a little more inclusive here and there and there. And I just think we've run the gamut of that. You know, it's kind of like it's a house on bad foundation that we put 500 rooms on and we know it's going to collapse, right?
Yeah.
And we're in a space now where I think we really have to get into the place of just redesigning from the center out. I learned from the center right out that that new structures, right, and new processes that that can serve us well, because we are deeply divided. I mean, people are divided. They're divided not only because of things they believe, but because they've been habituated into being divided, particularly in this country, right? It's just like that is the narrative. The narrative in this country is, there's one narrative, the nationalist narrative is we're Americans. The other narrative is, I'm somehow special and different than you, right? And we have both of those going on at the same time. And it's a little bit crazy making for everyone.
Yep.
We do this, you were talking about facilitation techniques. We have this device we use, we call it a question campaign, as a way to kind of cut through some of these divisions. And so the way it works is, like we did one in Cambridge on domestic violence. And so the way it works is we actually go out and, we work through neighborhood networks and associations, because the idea is it's about people asking people they know and trust to participate. And so that's the network flowing, and our belief is that people should be able, people shouldn't have to do much out of their normal daily activity routine in order to participate. And so how do you design that and make that possible? But the crux of this is we actually only ask people for one thing. We put out a prompt and we say, what's your question about domestic violence? It's as simple as that. And what's interesting is that the barrier is so low because basically by virtue of living in a place, people have a question about it, right?
Yep.
They automatically have a question. And those questions then actually start to give you a map of how people are seeing it. But then the next thing that we do is we bring people who have similar questions into conversations together. And then people find themselves in the room with people they didn't think they were going to be in the room with, right? Because the questions are the questions. And what we have people do in those conversations is not talk about domestic violence, but talk about what in their experience got them to that question.
Right.
Which is a way of understanding how the issue is being lived and exposing people to the different way a particular issue is being lived in a community.
And sometimes, so what that makes me think of is, I think about where and how do we create new spaces to be asking the deeper structural questions, and then to be able to get the like mandate and the resources and whatnot to actually sort of, you know, build these out and create new spaces. Because I think I've worked on a lot of reform efforts. Lot of sort of public agency reform, a lot of international, I've done a lot of reform stuff. And and the thing with reform, as you know, we know, is the questions that are being asked and then the parameters for like what is acceptable within that solution set. They are always going to be too narrow, too incremental, too slow. And because power likes to hold on to power. And so like where and how, like we have spaces where we're asking different questions, but I'm like looking for and trying to find places, especially when you're talking about like democracy and you're like, oh, you should talk to like this big NGO and this government agency. I'm like, no, like how do we create this anew? And I don't know, because yeah, people, you know, people with lived experience, you ask deeper, harder, more searching questions. And I think right now, you know, I think in sort of democracy space, I think something that is really interesting that is happening is I think a lot of folks are really excited about deliberative processes, citizen juries and assemblies and whatnot. And I think there's a lot of promise and potential there. At the same time, right now, most of them are being commissioned by governments that are defining the questions in certain ways. And they're, you know, I think with very few exceptions, there are no binding mechanisms for whatever answer citizens come out with to actually be implemented. And so I think it's an exciting time. I think the field is growing and whatnot. And I think it is at the risk of becoming yet another form of participatory theater, like the bad kind, not the good kind. And, you know, how do we sort of rescue that? You know, or create these new spaces. So yeah, that's what we have to be asking better questions and not just sort of with the mandate and the authority of, you know, folks who are interested is to protect like a mediocre status quo.
I want to introduce a question from our audience that I think is related to some of what you just brought up, Panthea, around reform and whether or not our current spaces are too restrictive or limited in terms of the imagination around it. So one of the questions is, how do we connect the people who are working on local systems changes with each other on a large enough scale that we globally render our dependence on the dominant system obsolete? So it's a bit of an ambitious question, but if either any of you want to kind of respond to that, how do we connect people working on that local systems change with each other, but do enable those connections at a global scale?
Well, I'm going to try a little bit of this because I think even at the local level, I'm going to say at the local level, in the places, communities I've been involved in, for the folks who are really actually trying to do, say, really systems change work, they are united around the idea that the system needs to be changed, but they're not united around the idea about how to do it, what it will look like. And so there's a division. There's a real kind of division that just keeps things from moving forward. And some of it's insidious. I mean, so for example, one of the things you'll see happening in Black and brown communities and poor communities, you will there'll be existing organizations that are struggling to deal with a particular issue. And that issue, maybe it's gun violence, maybe the issue is food supply. And they're struggling and they're trying to get local money and foundation monies and others support them, and they, you know, they get a little bit here and there, and they keep going. And then all of a sudden, someone from outside the community has $1 million to come in and do something, right? And this is like, it's not, this only happens every now and then. This is like, it just happens and happens and happens over and over again. And so there's this constant way in which people are struggling to survive. And not, I don't just mean the day-to-day substance of surviving, but for their ideas and the work they're doing to survive, right? Because there's so many things pushing against them. And I think we just don't have, I don't think we know how in this kind of social movement world, I shouldn't say we don't know how, because I've seen spaces where people have been able to do this, but it's a skill. It's like when I was listening to Audrey and how Audrey does, you know, I was just like, well, that's like, as you said, you know, that's like, you know, next level kind of human evolution. And I'm just like, okay. But one of the things that is really hard for us when we come together, folks who are trying to do the systems change work, is I think in our language and how we talk about things, it gets in our way. And so the way I think about it is like, we have this really phenomenal language and way to talk about critique. I call this language of critique. We can look at something, critique it, and tell you what's wrong with it, right? We also have this amazing language of action, right? Here's what we should do. Here's what, you know, and we also have this language of possibility. This is what we can get to, right? This is the vision. What we don't have is a language of transition, right? Which is that space in which you are trying to move things forward while you're having to hold the thing up that you're trying to change, right? Because that's the space we live in. And because we don't have good language for that, we don't know how to support each other in that space, which is where most of us, I think, you know, most of us occupy all the time, where we're, and so there's a constant, almost, I want to say metaphorically, throwing people under the bus, right? Mainly because we don't know how to talk about, you can be in these two places at the same time. It's in that Aztecian phrase, Nepatme, right? It's about being in this space between time, right? This transitional space, which is where we live, which means you have to be able to hold on to the thing that you're trying to do, be secure in the actions you're taking while you're still supporting this thing that you're trying to change, right? And that's what we do. But we don't have the language to really honor us in doing and living in that space. This is my thought. I don't know.
Yeah, I agree with what Ceasar said resonated deeply. How do you hold both how do you both hold it to be true that what we are all trying to do is forever going to be compromised and not enough, and just contorting to just the broken systems that we've inherited, and then that's the common sort of often language or frameworks or platforms that you're meeting sort of other collaborators in. Hold that to be true and sort of find the energy and the grace within yourself for yourself to also continue sort of building anew. And it's really hard. It's so hard. And I think what's really tough, I think going to someone's initial question too, around like how do we connect folks? Sure, there's like platforms and ways and communities of doing that, but I think the fundamental thing that we often then don't talk about is like, are you working on this issue? And then we like connect on the issue and go, you know, or like this action, or join my campaign, or do this, you know. We're always trying to just add more members to our thing, and, you know, and we're often don't create and have the space to sort of go deep on these questions. What are we doing and what are we compromising because we know this is just what we have to do? What are we doing because, you know, this is the true work? And I think it's hard because also many of us are just like overworked, underpaid, and like that kind of work is also really the stuff that people burn out on it, you know? And then at some point you're also just so desperate for it to work because you've given like in many ways, like you've sacrificed it. Like people start getting really desperate, and you can understand that at a deeply human level, but that also doesn't help the work move forward because then you're not able to invest in the relationship and the trust and the whatnot. I mean, in many ways, what I really admire what you're at Building Belonging are doing, because I feel like this is what you're trying to do. Right? You're trying to have these conversations and build communities around these ideas and give common language and framework and ideas for people to find each other, you know, around these ideas. And I think that's really brave. And I imagine that's really hard too, because it is such a rejection of so much of what we're taught around how do you, like, you know, make social change widgets and measure it in like clicks and eyeballs and whatever it is. And, you know, this is the stuff that, you know, in the current like broken funding models that we have, which, you know, we can all talk about. It's the stuff that it's hard, you know, and so then people start compromising, and then before you know it, you're just like running another campaign for eyeballs to like, you know, do whatever. So sorry, it's not as positive as I wanted it to be.
I was looking in the chat just now. Can I just raise something that's in the chat? I think it's really interesting. Actually, I want to raise it to you, Audrey, because I think it's a really interesting question, which is, are there families of powerful tool systems or technology that are designed in ways that they can't be used, or at least inherently resist being used, in nefarious and anti-democratic ways?
That's from Yusuf Schumann.
Yeah,
right?
for Yusuf, yes.
Yeah, whereas the previous question was from Natalie. Thought
Natalie,
we need
yeah.
to honor them. Right? So,
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and we're looking at one such technology. It's on the upper left corner of my screen. It's called Jitsi, and that's the video conferencing software we're using right now. And Jitsi belongs to a family of uppercase F free software /lib/open source technologies that empowers everyone using it to change it for their purpose. So for example, the human rights workers in Hong Kong is nowadays organizing readings of books on community organizing, much as people in Taiwan did under the martial law. They're under a kind of martial law now. And so they have to customize Jitsi to protect their identities, to support not just end-to-end encryption, but also the kind of deniability of them actually participating in such gatherings and so on. But ordinarily, if you use any other video conferencing software, you do not have the access to the source code or to the operational mechanisms that enable this kind of hosting. But because it's Jitsi, it could be self-hosted. I mean, I host an instance of Jitsi myself. It only took me like 5 minutes. Everybody can do it. And so you can actually customize to your heart's content and understanding that nobody will be between you and the person you connect to surveil or eavesdrops and so on. So in a sense, I really like how like Liberty or Liber software because it carries no notions of being gratis, not charging money. That's not the point. The point is that it's trusting the people using it as the ultimate controllers of technology. And whenever the people feel uncomfortable with how a technology works, a favorite saying in the free software community, if it breaks, you get to keep those pieces. And so you can connect it together exactly how you want. And that's how we run our civic infrastructures in Taiwan. The Taiwanese equivalent of Reddit is free software, been like that for 25 years, literally a student pet project, just like GC actually. It's called the PTT, and people can just contribute to its development, its governance. It serves no stakeholder interest other than the people who participate in it, in the sense that they doesn't have advertisers or shareholders as stakeholders. And that's how the governance works. And that's why we call it public digital infrastructure that's maintained by the civic sector. The AI facilitated conversation polis system at polis.gov.tw, even though it looks very official with that domain name, is actually just a free software project by the Mass and Democracy Foundation, initially from Seattle, also from the Occupy movement. Again, when the Canadian federal government saw that it only do monolingual consultation, they contributed the French, right, the bilingual automated translation to it. And then we took it and run a conversation with the US in the bilateral digital dialogues and so on. So everyone can customize it and only in a way that we feel secure, both cybersecurity and privacy-wise, do we introduce it as digital infrastructure. So I think, uppercase F, free software, software for liberty. I think these are the class of technologies that we're running with, and we're classifying as infrastructure. In 2016, that's the first time we convinced our budget office that these are also infrastructure, even though they're not concrete, like not made out of concrete. Still, it warrants infrastructure status in the infrastructure bill.
I love that, and I'm definitely going to be using Jitsi instead of Zoom from now on.
Though the rest of us might take 50 minutes, not Audrey's 5.
I know, but 50 minutes is okay.
We're not all
It's okay. 50 minutes isn't too much.
So unfortunately, our time together is coming to a close, although I wish it could go on for far longer, because I feel like there's still so many interesting things that we only touched upon today. But just to, I think, close out the conversation, typically how we end these conversations in Building Belonging is by sharing some tangible practice for all of our viewers related to this theme that they can do starting today or tomorrow. Something tangible that even at an individual level, everyone can start practicing. And so I was hoping for each of you, you would be able to share some small practice that you would encourage everyone to adopt. And then Brian will close us out.
Brian will close us out.
Ceasar, can I prompt you to talk about designing from the margins?
You can prompt me to do that. Yeah, it's a thing that I believe in very much, that when we're designing systems or processes, that we should design them first for the people who are most marginalized in society, that it work for them, because people who are in the middle, in the general population, they'll find their way into it because they have resources and more access. And so if we don't do that, and we only, so that's my thing. Keep that in your head. Design for the margins. Design with, but the idea is work from the margins. All right.
I can jump in. It sounds so basic, but I often think about just with every person you meet, how do you just stop and take the time to like understand them as a human, you know, and what are the questions, how do you bring that sort of into their interactions to like celebrate their full humanity? And then I think also for sort of the practice of democracy, how can you understand or try to understand how their lived experience and their lineage and where they come from, how that intersects with your own, right? How that intersects with your own. And I think a lot lately about, as we're trying to sort of move forward into sort of more perfect unions, more authentic relationships, recognizing that lineage, recognizing their humanity, what can you do to like create more space, give up more power, take up less room, like in whatever form, so that everyone else has sort of more space and room to thrive. And so, you know, lots of different ways that can look, from friendships to other relationships to whatnot. But something for us all to think about.
I guess I'll honor Leon from the live stream, whose question doesn't get answered, because it's such a all-encompassing question, I guess. And I quote, how do we make social justice the most pleasurable human experience? And how can we awaken within ourselves desires that makes it impossible to settle for anything less than a fulfilling life? A really beautiful question. And I've been pondering about it for quite a while, which is why I didn't jump on it. And I think a lot of it is in the language. If we keep saying human resource, if we keep saying incentivizing the companies, you know, the kind of the almost perverse category confusion. I think that is what is keeping us a lot of our energy just canceling each other out, because it was applying on the categorically impossible categories. And so I guess I'll just offer my job description as Digital Minister of Taiwan as a prayer also, but also a call to action on how to shape language that shapes our community and how the community is thinking. And my job description, which is really short, goes like this. When we see the Internet of Things, let's make it an Internet of Beings. When we see virtual reality, let's make it a shared reality. When we see machine learning, let's make it collaborative learning. When we see user experience, let's make it about human experience. And whenever we hear that a singularity is near, let us always remember the plurality is here. Thank you.
Oof. So beautiful.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. Wow.
Well, thank you. Well, Nicole, did you want to offer a practice or something that is alive for you?
Oh, did I want to offer a practice? Ooh. I think I would second Ceasar's, the designing from the margins piece, because for all the, if there are any civic technologists listening into this conversation, there's so many tools being built for the average user. We don't really need more people thinking about that, I think. And so I think building for folks who have been historically left out of these conversations will lead us to, I think, be able to broaden our imagination for what technology can and should do for us, rather than what we can do for it.
Yeah, I love the other connection that you're all making me think of from our last conversation on transformation just before the year end was on power and how we think about power and belonging. And one of the, Cindy Suarez, who was part of that, talked about designing from desire, which I just found such a wonderful framework, right? Like, what if instead of thinking of all the things we're trying to stop or oppose or that we're afraid of, we just really tuned into that thing that gives us joy, that heart callings. That's what I kind of heard reading Leon's question, which is, as he reminds us, a quotation, or they remind us, a quotation from Audrey Brown. So yeah, I'm just really grateful to all of you. I think, I'm thinking about sort of next steps for this configuration of humans, and partly what we are trying to do, both with building belonging generally and these conversations in particular, is bring folks together who are holding these questions and moving and acting on them in really deep and interesting ways. And so my hope is that part of what we do here helps spark some other things that we might carry forward. We'll have other conversations on transformation on some other topics that are still percolating out there, and invite both this group and other folks who are out there to think about what might be a space to have some of the conversations that we've alluded to here. I know the 4 folks that I'm looking at on my screen all are pretty deeply plugged into different communities that are thinking about this. And part of my own frustration as not a civic technologist, of someone who's looking deeply to trying to find tools that can help serve my aspirations for belonging, is how hard it is to stay up, right? Like, I'm not even sure what Panthea was talking about earlier with Potbox. I was like, Potbox? Like, what was that exactly? Clubhouse, right? And so trying to find tools that respond to the question that Yusuf raised around, like, how do I trust that a tool is actually serving our aspirations for liberation and belonging and democracy, versus one that is interested in commodifying my data and marketing it off to whoever's willing to pay. So really appreciative for everyone holding the space. Grateful to Nicole for ably hosting. I was intimidated by being in the presence of all these folks who know technology so much more. Maybe what I can offer as a closing checkout for folks is just for those who are on the live stream as well, we can go around, I'll start and then name somebody. If you could just pass it along, is just whatever your embodied sensation is at this moment. So a feeling in your body below your neck, ideally, as we're talking about technology and stuffed in these chairs for 90 minutes here. How are you leading this conversation? What's the sense you're feeling? And as someone who is way too in my head all the time, that's always a challenge. And I think what I'm feeling is like a coiled energy, like a potential in my chest that kind of wants to spring out, but is harnessed. And I will pass to Panthea.
I'm feeling kinetic in a good way. Like ding, 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 ding. So good. Thank you for all the nourishment and inspiration. I will pass to Audrey.
Okay, I'm feeling lively. Seeing how I joined the conversation, literally just waking up. This has been a gradually waking up process. So I feel much more vividly my heartbeat now. I'm more alive, I guess, as a result of this conversation. And I'll pass to Ceasar.
Yeah, I'm feeling actually a sense of calm. It's a hopeful calm. I don't know how. It's just like, it's just the potentiality's there. It's there. So my body is just relaxed. And at the end of the day, when you've been on Zoom all day, for your body to feel relaxed, that means you've really gone through something transformative. So that's it to you.
I feel warm and fuzzy, I think. I'm just so grateful, not only for your time in this hour and a half, but for all of the work that you do, inspiring others to follow non-traditional paths and have just a broader imagination for the type of work that we can be doing at every scale. So thank you again.
Hear, hear. Well, thank
Wonderful
you
meeting
all.
you all.
I'm going to toggle over and stop the live stream for folks out there. Join us wherever you may be in the world. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Live long and prosper.
Stop the live stream here in our room.